Okay, so we're diving into Argentina today, trying to get to the bottom of all this talk about an economic miracle. Is it the real deal or just hype?
Well, it's certainly a story that grabs your attention. Argentina's economic history is, let's just say, pretty wild.
Yeah, wild might be an understatement. I mean, think about this. They've been in recession for almost a third of their modern history. That puts them in the same league as places like Iraq and Syria. It's mind-boggling. How did they even end up in this situation?
That is the question, isn't it? The core issue is that for decades, Argentina's growth has been way too reliant on domestic demand and government spending, often driven by these booms in their agricultural sector. But you know what? This approach has, time and time again, led to overspending, huge current account deficits, and then, of course, they end up needing bailouts from international organizations. It's this frustrating cycle of boom and bust.
And then along comes Javier Milei, calls himself an anarcho-capitalist, and he's taking this like radical shock therapy approach to the economy.
It's really fascinating stuff because Milei is basically tossing out the traditional economic playbook, especially that Keynesian model. You know, the one that says the government should step in during recessions. He's all about fiscal discipline, cutting government spending, and making the bureaucracy smaller, even when the economy is shrinking. It's a big gamble.
And speaking of bold moves, what exactly does anarcho-capitalism even mean? It sounds pretty intense.
In essence, it's a political philosophy that wants to get rid of the state entirely. Instead, you have a society governed by individual freedom and free markets. So in Milei's ideal world, the private sector would take over all the roles the government typically handles. Think law enforcement, the courts, even national defense.
Wow, that's a huge shift from the norm. But going back to this shock therapy, haven't we seen something similar before? Didn't Russia try this in the 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed?
You're right. There are definitely parallels to those post-Soviet economic transitions. However, it's crucial to remember that those reforms, particularly in Russia, were ultimately held back by a lack of commitment to real free market principles. They talked about liberalization, but they kept meddling in the market, propping up unproductive sectors, failing to establish clear property rights. It ended up creating this virtual economy full of corruption and stifled competition.
So is Milei trying to learn from those past mistakes?
It seems like he is. He's really emphasizing true liberalization, deregulation, and making sure property rights are clear. He's basically trying to signal to the world that Argentina is open for business, and he's willing to back that up with action.
Okay, so he's definitely shaking things up. But how's this gamble actually working out? What are the early results of this shock therapy?
Well, the initial signs are pretty remarkable. When he came into office in December, inflation was a crazy 211% year on year. But it's been steadily going down for 5 straight months. They even managed to get a budget surplus in February, the first time in over a decade. That's a big achievement. And recent economic reports show that poverty is declining significantly.
That does sound really positive, but are there any economists out there who are saying, hold on, it's too early to call this an economic miracle?
Oh, absolutely. While those initial results are encouraging, there are still major challenges. Investment remains low, capital markets are underdeveloped, and the country desperately needs upgrades to its infrastructure.
You're right. I read that Argentina has one of the lowest infrastructure investment rates in all of Latin America. They're way behind countries like Honduras and Panama. So even if Milei can fix these immediate problems in the economy, can he actually transform things for the long term?
That's the million-dollar question. It's almost like they've put a tourniquet on a serious wound to stop the bleeding, but now they need to do the complicated surgery to heal the underlying damage.
Okay, let's dig into that surgery then. What are some of the key areas Milei's targeting to get that long-term sustainable growth?
One of the main pillars of his strategy is shifting away from growth led by the government. He wants to see a model where the private sector is driving things. He believes that businesses, not the government, should be the primary engine of economic growth.
That makes sense, especially given his anarcho-capitalist views. So where does his focus on liberalization come in? Things like freeing up markets, reducing trade barriers, attracting foreign investment.
Exactly. The idea is to unleash the potential of Argentina's economy by getting the government out of the way and letting the free market do its thing.
You know, I came across a fascinating example of this in action. Earlier this year, when Milei got rid of rent control in Buenos Aires, the housing supply shot up by almost 200%, and then rent prices dropped by 40%.
That's a perfect example of how these market reforms can really have a positive impact, especially for those who are most vulnerable. It kind of challenges that common idea that deregulation only helps the wealthy.
It does seem counterintuitive, but the results are pretty clear. But I bet there are still a lot of people who are wary of Milei's approach, given Argentina's history of economic ups and downs. What are some of the concerns people are raising?
You're right. A lot of Argentinians have this deep-seated belief that the government needs to step in to protect people from the volatility of the free market.
Which, given their past experiences, makes sense. But how's Milei addressing those concerns and trying to show people that his approach is different?
One of the ways he's doing this is by really stressing transparency and accountability. He's been very open about his plans and why he's doing what he's doing. He's also taken steps to make the government more transparent.
So he's trying to build trust and show that he's not just going to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Exactly. He's trying to create an environment that's more stable and predictable, where businesses and individuals feel confident about investing and planning for the future.
That makes sense. But we can't forget about how all of this is affecting people. Beyond the economic indicators, what's the impact of these reforms on everyday Argentinians?
That's a key question. One of the biggest challenges for Milei has been dealing with inflation, which has been eroding the purchasing power of Argentinians for years.
And from what we've talked about, it seems like he's making some progress there. But what about wages and jobs? Are people seeing actual improvements from this economic growth?
Well, that's where things get a little more complex. The initial impact of Milei's spending cuts actually caused the economy to shrink further. Wages went down and unemployment went up.
That doesn't sound very appealing, especially if you're trying to convince people to get on board with this new economic model.
True. But Milei's argument is that these short-term difficulties are necessary to lay the foundation for long-term growth. He's basically saying, stick with me, things will get better.
A bold statement, that's for sure. So is there anything to suggest that his gamble might pay off?
Well, recent data does offer a glimmer of hope. The economy is showing signs of recovery. Wages and pensions in the private sector are starting to rise again, and that decline in inflation is giving consumers some relief.
So there is a chance that this shock therapy could actually work. But it's still too early to know for sure.
Absolutely. And there's another crucial factor we need to consider: Argentina's education system.
Right. I read that their education system has fallen behind compared to their neighbors in recent decades.
Exactly. And that's a big concern if Argentina wants to compete in the global economy, which is increasingly driven by knowledge and innovation. Even if Milei manages to create a more stable and prosperous economy, they've got to invest in their people to make sure everyone benefits from that prosperity.
That's a really important point. It's not just about creating wealth. It's about creating opportunities for all Argentinians. Now, speaking of opportunities, I'm curious about Argentina's vast natural resources. Could those play a role in their economic comeback?
Absolutely. Argentina is incredibly rich in natural resources. They've got vast agricultural land, massive oil and gas reserves, and incredible biodiversity.
But haven't they struggled to manage those resources well in the past?
That's true. They've had problems with deforestation, overfishing, and pollution. And as we talked about earlier, their infrastructure needs a serious overhaul to efficiently get those resources to market.
So it sounds like Milei has a lot on his plate.
He does, but there are signs that he's serious about tackling these issues. He's talked about the need to balance economic growth with protecting the environment, and he's made some moves to attract investment in renewable energy.
Like that new law that lets people generate their own electricity and sell it back to the grid. That's a pretty progressive step.
It is. And if Argentina can get this right, they have the potential to become a leader in sustainable development.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's try to summarize. Is Argentina really on the verge of an economic miracle?
It's a tough question. There's definitely a sense of optimism in the air, and Milei's bold reforms have definitely shaken things up. But Argentina also has a history of dashed hopes and broken promises.
So what's different this time? Why should we believe that Milei can succeed where others have failed?
Well, one thing is that there's a real sense of urgency. The economic crisis that Argentina was facing before Milei came into office was arguably the worst they've ever seen. People are desperate for change, and Milei is offering them a radical alternative.
And he's doing it with a level of conviction and commitment that we haven't seen from previous leaders.
That's true. And remember, he's just getting started. It's still early days.
So the jury's still out on whether Argentina can pull this off.
Absolutely. But it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
That's for sure. Well, thanks for diving deep with us. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into the potential for an economic miracle in Argentina, where we'll explore the impact of Milei's reforms on different sectors of the economy.
So let's pick up where we left off and really dig into how these reforms are actually impacting different sectors of the Argentinian economy.
Sounds good to me. Where should we start?
Well, agriculture has always been a cornerstone of Argentina's economy. They're a major exporter of soybeans, corn, wheat, you name it. But for years, the sector has been weighed down by high export taxes and government intervention.
So how has Milei's shock therapy approach changed things for agriculture?
One of the first things he did was slash those export taxes on agricultural products. This was huge for farmers because now they've got more incentive to actually produce and export their crops.
Makes sense. Lower taxes, more incentive to sell. But are there any downsides to this approach?
Of course, there are always trade-offs. Some critics worry that cutting export taxes could lead to higher food prices within Argentina, and that would hit lower-income households the hardest.
That's a valid concern. Has Milei addressed that at all?
He has. His argument is that the increased economic activity from a booming agricultural sector will ultimately benefit everyone, including consumers. He also emphasizes the role of free trade and competition in keeping prices in check.
Okay, so it's a balancing act like most economic policies.
Yeah.
What about other sectors? How are they doing under Milei's reforms?
Another sector that's getting a lot of attention is energy. Argentina has huge reserves of oil and natural gas, especially in that Vaca Muerta shale formation.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Is it supposed to be one of the largest shale oil and gas reserves in the world?
You got it. But developing those resources has been tough because of a lack of investment in infrastructure.
So how is Milei trying to change that?
He's put in place policies designed to attract foreign investment into the energy sector, things like tax breaks and simpler regulations. And there's definitely been more interest from international energy companies since these reforms were put in place.
Interesting. So could Argentina actually become a major energy exporter in the future?
It's definitely possible. But there are still obstacles they need to overcome. Like they need to develop a lot more infrastructure, pipelines, export terminals, things like that.
Right. We talked before about how Argentina's infrastructure investment is among the lowest in Latin America. Is Milei doing anything to address that big picture issue?
He is. He's proposed a bunch of infrastructure projects, new highways, railroads, ports. His argument is that these investments are crucial if you want to unlock Argentina's economic potential. But of course, these projects need a ton of money, which is a challenge considering the country's financial situation right now.
It sounds like he's trying to tackle these problems from multiple angles. But with all this focus on economic growth, what about the social safety net? Are things like healthcare and education being affected by Milei's reforms?
That's a crucial part of this whole economic shift. You know, one of the criticisms of this shock therapy approach is that it often leads to cuts in social programs, and that can make inequality even worse.
And is that happening in Argentina?
To some degree, yes. Milei has reduced spending on certain social programs as part of his overall effort to cut government spending. But he says that these cuts are necessary to get the country's finances in order, and that a stronger economy will eventually mean more resources for social programs down the road.
So it's kind of a things might get tougher before they get better argument.
Exactly. But it is important to point out that Milei has also put in place some very specific social programs designed to soften the impact of his reforms on the most vulnerable people.
Like what, for example?
Well, for instance, he's introduced a program that gives cash directly to low-income families who have kids attending school regularly. This program is meant to help alleviate poverty and encourage education at the same time.
Okay, so he's not abandoning the social safety net altogether, but he's trying to make it more efficient and targeted.
That seems to be the goal.
Yeah.
But we'll have to wait and see if this approach actually works to both boost economic growth and protect the people who need help the most.
It's a tough balancing act. And speaking of tough balancing acts, how's Milei dealing with Argentina's massive debt?
That's one of the biggest challenges he faces. We talked earlier about Argentina's history of debt crises, and right now their debt to GDP ratio is over 100%. That's really high.
So how is he tackling that?
He's using a multi-pronged approach. Firstly, he's trying to renegotiate the terms of Argentina's existing debt with its creditors. The goal is to reduce the overall debt burden.
And how's that going?
It's a tough negotiation, to be honest. Creditors are understandably cautious about giving Argentina another break, given their past, but Milei is arguing that his reforms are creating a more stable and trustworthy economic environment, and that should make creditors more willing to work with him.
Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. What else is he doing?
Secondly, he's totally focused on cutting government spending. That's absolutely essential to get the country's finances under control and make it more appealing to investors.
We've already talked about the spending cuts. Are there any other strategies he's using?
He's also looking for ways to increase government revenue, but he's ruled out raising taxes. Instead, he's considering things like privatizing some state-owned companies and really cracking down on tax evasion.
So he's trying to create a more sustainable fiscal situation without doing things that would harm economic growth.
Exactly. But it's a huge task, and there's no guarantee it will work. The success or failure of these efforts will probably determine whether Argentina can finally break out of this cycle of booms and busts.
It sounds like Milei is walking a tightrope. If he succeeds, it could be an incredible turnaround for Argentina. But if he fails, the consequences could be disastrous.
That's the risk you take with any radical economic transformation. There will always be winners and losers. And in Argentina, the stakes are incredibly high.
So what's the overall mood in Argentina? Are people hopeful about the future, or are they still skeptical?
There's definitely a sense of hope and excitement in the air. People are tired of how things have been, and they're ready to give Milei a chance. But there's also a lot of uncertainty and worry. A lot of Argentinians have heard these kinds of promises before and been let down.
It's understandable that they would be cautious. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the human side of these reforms. We've touched on some of the social implications, but I'm really interested in learning more about how everyday Argentinians are experiencing these changes.
That's a crucial part of the story that often gets lost in the economic analysis. Let's explore that in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've gone over the big economic picture, and we've talked about how Milei's reforms are impacting different sectors. But now I want to zoom in and understand how this is all playing out for everyday people in Argentina. What are their hopes, their worries, the human side of things?
You're absolutely right. We need to look beyond the numbers and the charts. It's about real people's lives. So let's imagine someone like Maria. She's a single mom working as a teacher in a public school in Buenos Aires.
Okay, Maria, so how has her life been affected by all these economic changes?
For Maria, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's some cautious optimism, but also a lot of uncertainty still lingering. On the one hand, she's definitely feeling relieved that inflation seems to be cooling off.
Yeah, that makes sense. We talked earlier about how devastating that runaway inflation has been for Argentina.
Exactly. For someone like Maria, who's on a fixed income, seeing those prices skyrocket for basic things, it was just incredibly hard to make ends meet. So this recent slowdown in inflation has given her some breathing room, which is huge.
But I'm guessing it's not all good news for Maria.
You're right. Those spending cuts that Milei's government put in place, well, they've led to a smaller budget for her school. That means fewer resources for her classroom. And there's this constant worry about salary freezes or even layoffs down the line.
So she's benefiting from lower inflation, but at the same time, she's dealing with job insecurity and a decline in the quality of her work environment.
Exactly. It's a real balancing act. And Maria's not alone in this. A lot of public sector workers in Argentina are facing these same kinds of challenges.
What about folks working in the private sector? How are they being impacted?
Let's picture someone like Juan. He's a young entrepreneur who just launched a tech startup in Buenos Aires.
Okay, Juan, the tech guy. So how has the whole Milei effect played out for his venture?
Well, for Juan, the early signs are looking pretty good. The emphasis on deregulation and attracting foreign investment, that's created a much more favorable environment for startups like his.
So there's a feeling of opportunity, a buzz in the air for entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. Juan's energized by the idea of a more dynamic, competitive economy. He's seeing increased interest from investors, both within Argentina and from overseas.
But I imagine he's also facing some challenges.
Of course, access to capital is still a major obstacle for startups in Argentina. Milei's reforms have definitely improved things, but there's still a long way to go to build a strong venture capital scene.
So for Juan, it's this mix of optimism because of the new opportunities, but also the reality of operating in an economy that's still developing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that kind of reflects the general feeling in Argentina right now. A lot of potential, but a lot of uncertainty too.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's your big takeaway? Is Argentina really on the road to an economic miracle?
Well, it's still too early to say for sure. There are some very encouraging signs, but there are also some major hurdles ahead. Whether Milei's reforms succeed will depend on a few key things.
Like what, specifically?
First, he's got to keep up the momentum on tackling inflation and making the economy more stable. Second, he needs to attract consistent foreign investment, and that means convincing people that Argentina's economy is a good long-term bet.
And of course, there's the human element. like we've been talking about.
Exactly. Milei has to show that his reforms are going to benefit everyone in Argentina, not just a small group. He's got to address the concerns about inequality and make sure that any economic gains are shared broadly.
So it's a really complex and challenging situation.
It is. And it's going to be really interesting to see how it all unfolds in the next few months and years. Argentina's story is a good reminder that economic transformation isn't just about numbers and policies. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams. It's a reminder that change is hard and that the journey can be unpredictable.
Very well said. It's a story of risk, resilience, and that constant striving for a better future. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the possibility of an economic miracle in Argentina.
You're welcome. It's been a fascinating conversation.
And to you, our listener, we leave you with this question. What does it truly take for a nation to break free from the burdens of its past and create a new path to prosperity? Argentina's story isn't over yet, and the world is watching to see what happens next.